pressure in my tissues. I have pressure in my blood. On this arterial end, materials need to move out. Materials like to go from an area of high concentration to low. Yes, no, maybe.
Yes.
Now, if this is materials coming in to these tissues are carrying out their processes that they have to do. So they are making wastes. So if this gets all of my nutrients moved out, when I'm in this capillary and I meet the venous end, I don't have any more nutrients to move. The only thing I can move now are my wastes. Once again, I have a pressure in my tissues and a pressure, very low, in my veins. It wants to go from the area of high concentration to low.
Which contains waste.
Which is the waste. Stuff like the CO2, breakdown of certain type, whatever the case might be, okay? So since there's no more nutrients to move, basically waste are high, low here, waste move in, and continue through the veins. Now, your textbook, like I said, it's going to talk to you a whole lot about these numbers. I don't care about that, okay? I mean, I do, all right? And if I were sending you out to be cardiovascular people, I would be telling you exactly what that means. But I have movement in my tissues with the arterial side, tissues with the venous side. However, there has to be almost a suction type environment created. The way the body does that, what do you notice about my net numbers in the artery side versus the venous? My artery side is higher. And having that difference from one side to the next, it creates a suction. And therefore creating fluid movement. And the way that we get this, because my arterial blood is full of nutrients, little waste, it would stand to reason my nutrients move. My venous side is low in nutrients, therefore all the waste from the tissues need to go somewhere, and it's low in the waste, so my waste get to move in. It's based simply on a difference in pressure. And for the most part, material moves from an area of high concentration to low concentration. The more active those tissues are, the more blood flow they will get. That's it. This is in a nutshell. Trust me, it's way more complicated. But let the doctors deal with that. Okay? This is how we nourish the tissues of our body. It's pretty cool, right? Now, when the fluids move, and if we get a buildup of fluid in the tissues, something that we have mentioned quite a few times, okay, this is edema. Meaning that these pressures and the movement of those materials is no longer sufficient for those tissues. Water is going to stay behind. It could be a ton of reasons why movement is incorrect, okay? Sickness, trauma, diseases, cancers. It could be a ton of reasons. But anytime fluid stays behind in those tissues and builds up, it's edema. And we've talked about it in several ways. Backing up in the lungs, as well as backing up throughout the generalized parts of the body, like in the ankles, the feet, the legs, that sort of thing. Now, what we're going to find, the more movement you have, the better your blood returns to the heart. The better it's going to move through the tissues. So our venous return, basically the movement through those veins, for the most part, like I keep saying, pressure is low in the veins. However, pressure gradients, there's a tiny, tiny amount of pressure in some of the veins, but we can also create a pressure gradient with movement. Simply walking across the floor will help to move that venous blood. Now, gravity plays a part in the movement, especially in the head and neck region. Because for venous return from the head and the neck, it's pretty much working with gravity. But anything from the area of the heart down has to work against gravity for the return. We are dependent on the skeletal muscle. I know it's not punt. I think I've got another type of pump. Thank you. Okay, pump. Who typed this? All right. Now, please change that to pump on your things. One of the things that happens with our lower limbs, our movement, the greater our movement, the much better our blood flow to everything, even stuff like the cartilage in our knees. And when we are moving, we call this the skeletal muscle pump. The thoracic pump is what happens from the diaphragm and the abdomen, thoracic cavity. Every time we breathe, we're moving muscles, and this helps to return blood from this area to the heart, which I think I mentioned the other day on how we get the blood back. Now, when we do not have blood supply good enough to meet the metabolic demands of the body, meaning however active those tissues might be, we're going to have, or can have, shock. When we say cardiogenic shock, this means the heart is not pumping correctly. So usually we find cardiogenic shock in relationship to what we see happening when someone has a heart attack. When someone has a heart attack, well, their heart is just not pumping right, okay? We can have low venous return shock, meaning the flow throughout the veins. Basically, the cardiac output, I did not check these over before I finished, is low because basically blood returning to the heart is low. We're not moving enough, we're not getting enough blood movement back to the heart, so therefore the output of the heart is not great. When we talk about low venous return shock.
Sorry, are we not going to go, going back to the mechanisms of the venous return, do we not need to know the cardiac section?
I talked about the cardiogenic. But
it was like another thing, it just talked about cardiac section, it's like a different category.
I might have it later.
You don't have a little bit
Out of order.
Okay.
Because it matched with something else. Now, the forms of the low venous return, meaning the blood returning to the heart. The most common is hypovolemic. This is most likely what you will encounter when you get into your chosen professions. It is due to the blood loss of the trauma. The body has lost too much blood. It is severe dehydration, and unless you need to address it immediately or the person will die. And they still may die if you address it immediately. We could have something that's obstructing the blood flow. Tumors, for example. This would be obstructed venous return. Venous pooling, a lot of this happens to us all the time. You know, as you all sit here for class, your blood is pooling. However, you know, I try to give you the break to get up and move around. Then hopefully when you leave, you're going to move, go move around. But people who sit or stand for long periods of time, they can get venous pooling, which is going to be too much blood in the lower extremities. If it's neurogenic, it could be that you're moving around enough, but because of the nervous system, it's not affecting motor tone, meaning dilation and constriction enough, and the pooling could still occur. So this one right here is the most common.
Would arterial blood loss still be called low venous return because it's still not getting back to the heart? Like,
okay, wait a minute. Can arterial what?
Like for the hypovolemic, if someone were to like an artery just catch, would that still be considered?
Yes,
okay.
This would be considered that. That's why it's going to be the most common that you come across in cases of trauma.
It's just venous return as in like a return to the heart. It can occur
All together. Mm-hmm. Septic shock. This means that some type of bacteria has released toxins in the body that will trigger vasodilation. And it becomes difficult for the heart to meet that demand because the heart cannot meet the demand of all the capillaries being dilated at one time. And if a bacteria is trying to make everything dilate, it can't meet that demand. And because it's a bacteria and it's a toxin, that's why it's termed septic.
So hypovolemic is the most common, not venous pooling.
Well, under the venous pooling, the one that accumulates in the lower legs is the most common.
Okay, Lord.
Yeah. Anaphylactic shock. This is the one that happens when it's an allergic reaction. People who know that this is something they can suffer from usually carry the EpiPens with them. The response to circulatory shock is clinically significant. Compensated shock versus decompensated. In compensated shock, we have homeostatic mechanisms in the body that are working to try to maintain homeostasis. What it's going to do, it's going to trigger sympathetic actions. Okay? That means the sympathetic system, all right, the way that it's going to work will try to make the return go back to normal. For example, syncope. What is that? Fainting. All right. That means have any of you ever gone from sitting or lying down too quickly and you're like,
Oh, yeah.
okay, that's a form of syncope. Because the blood pressures, okay, are now having to meet the demand of that gravity. And for some people, they'll actually faint. Fainting is the body's way to return the heart rate and the respiratory rate back to normal. Note, there hasn't been any severe trauma that has occurred, okay? And a lot of times, they faint, pass out, everything goes back to normal. And then that whole thing of where people like to elevate their feet, oh, get the feet up, get the feet up, get the feet up, when they pass out or whatever. This is true, okay? Get that blood moving back to the brain, because that's what's happened. The brain has been cut off, okay? I love that.
Like a roller coaster.